What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, where for over 16 years we've been bringing you ideological goodness, interviews with scholars across the disciplines, so you can think, reflect, and wrestle with your own faith. And today, returning to the podcast is my friend Brian McLaren. He's got a brand new book out. That's right, Life After Doom. And well, despite the title, this conversation's packed full of hope, but a hope that comes right after clarity and honesty about all the crises and challenges we face. It's a fun one, it's a good one, and I know you're going to enjoy it. But before we jump in, I want to tell you something. Brian McLaren, he's coming to Theology Beer Camp. That's right, October 17th and 19th, Brian McLaren will be a part of our big event every year, Theology Beer Camp. And it's not just him. Diana Butler-Bass is going to be there. Ilya Dilio is going to be there. John Tatominal, Gary Dorian. Come on, Jorg Rieger's going to be in the house. Grace G. Sun Kim, Christy Whaley, Leah Robinson, Adam Clark. It's going to be fun. It's going to be fun. And that's not even all the excitement. There's going to be over 30 podcasters in the house. 500 plus people who all are ready to nerd out with their geeks out, enjoy some tasty craft beverages, and have themselves a good old time. So get pumped, get ready, go to theologybeer.camp, grab your ticket. The prices go up June 1st, so feel the lure, my friends. And last thing, before we jump in, we are about to launch our next upcoming online class here at Homebrewed. It is called Faith and Politics for the Rest of Us. That's right. Our contemporary public square is increasingly chaotic, toxic, repulsive, yet our challenge as a people, nation, and species are growing. The rise of Christian nationalism repulses a whole bunch of Christians, but an increasing number of people reach out and say, Trip, I know what I'm not. I know what grosses me out, but what else is there? And that's why Diana Butler-Bass and Tim from the New Evangelicals decided to hang out with me this June and a whole bunch of you for Faith and Politics for the Rest of Us. And we're not just going to be exploring it or complaining or critiquing. We're going to be introducing you to a host of different live options, expressions of theological depth, wrestling with our current political situation and what are the different visions and options on the table. We're going to be joined by Kevin Carnahan, that's right, a Christian realist in that Niebuhr tradition, to introduce that perspective. Jennifer Harvey, a powerful queer theologian, is going to be in the house reflecting and offering another perspective. And then our friend Reggie Williams is going to be here, who you've heard on the podcast before, talk about Bonhoeffer's encounter with the Black church in Harlem. He's going to be helping us think out of that theological tradition about politics in the present. Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove is going to be here. He's coming right from Yale University's Center for Public Theology and Public Policy, but he, like me, is a native of North Carolina, has been a part of the neo-monastic movement. And what is that movement form of political power? What happens when our assumptions about the church are not a community always already embedded and determined by the dominant expressions of culture? Well, you see, we're going to have a host of these different options, as well as two scholars, Julie Ingersoll, who is a professor at University of North Florida, where she spent a lot of time looking at Christian Reconstruction and Christian nationalism and how it's developed over time, as well as Robert P. Jones, who's in charge at the Public Religion Institute. He's going to be there helping us understand the history and legacy of Christian nationalism and the challenges that face us. But if you want to join this, it's going to be fun. It's going to be awesome. Just head over to faithandpolitics.net. And like all of our open classes, it's donation-based, including zero. So feel the lure, come on out, and have some fun. Now, here we go. Me, my friend Brian McLaren, talking about his brand new book, Life After Doom. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Trip. Returning to the podcast is Brian McLaren, who's got a brand new book, Life After Doom. Wisdom and courage for a world falling apart. And it's not just the world falling apart. The internet did last time we tried to record this. So We are resisting the internet demons and going for it again. So thanks for being here, Brian.
Hey, man, great to be with you again.
Yes, yes. So, when first got this book, it was one of those where, if you're a Brian McLaren fan, I hope you are, but as one without the name and also a fan, you kind of start reading it, and then you want to go like, oh well, which of Brian's superpowers are going to be on display during the book? And this one actually brings together three of them you've done well throughout your career. One is it articulates a vision of the faith positively while addressing realities that are often the reasons we mute or get hesitant with speaking about the presence of God, the invitation of hope, and such. It also, much like the first time I read Everything Must Change, it doesn't flinch when talking about reality and describing it in a way where it's not just a potential death sentence, but it's the fruit of choices, conscious and unconscious, that we make, that the systems we're a part of are making, and that we're inheriting. And it's truth telling in a way that makes the third part, Brian being a bunch of people's favorite fake minister. Like that we don't get to have you in our congregation each week, but what happens when you're able to hold a confession of the faith and the brokenness of reality and proclaim the gospel? And I think it brings together so many of my favorite things. So this is Tripp's hearty endorsement.
Oh, thanks, man. Thanks. Well, it means a lot, especially coming from you. So I appreciate that. Yeah, the book I wrote right before this, Do I Stay Christian, in some ways was a warm up for this, because in facing the failures of the Christian religion in many or most of its forms over the last couple thousand years, the one that I really understated in Do I Stay Christian, although I addressed it, was our role in setting us up for the exploitation of the earth, uh, and to feel that we were actually serving God and obeying a verse in Genesis by dominating and subduing the earth to our own will. At any rate, that really takes center stage here, and I I suppose one of the things that happens to you when you're a pastor for 24 years as your full-time job is that you sort of you can't stop being pastor. So, uh, and I feel that with our current situation, what many call the poly crisis or the meta crisis, um, my heart just goes out to so many good people who are feeling the worst they've ever felt in their lives. They're feeling, uh, this sense of doom, this sense of being overwhelmed, and my heart goes out to them, and I want to help. But the way to help is not to say it's not as bad as you think, because it is very, very bad.
When you begin bringing the all the different threads that lead to our current crises,
Mm.
like, is there a particular one that you found attending to
Mm.
it gives a narrative for understanding the big web
Yeah.
of ugliness that often we want to deny, repress, excuse?
Yes. Yeah. Well, as you know, as a writer yourself, Trip, one of the best things that happens to you when you're a writer is when you feel you're learning something when you write. I know some people have their whole outline worked out and it's just sort of execute on what they already know. I always feel that my books are going to work the best if I feel I'm learning a lot in the writing process. And that certainly happened in response to this question. Near the end of the book, I talk about this sort of epiphany I had that I call my energy epiphany, to realize that everything is energy in one sense, I mean, if we're talking E equals MC squared, that's one way of talking about it. But
Mm-hmm.
when I realized that we human beings, uh, we need to eat, we need to drink, we need to breathe. Well, why do we need to eat, drink, and breathe? Well, because when we breathe, we take in oxygen that helps with the combustion and the sustenance uh, of our life processes. When we drink, we need water to metabolize uh,
Hmm.
the elements that we take from the food that we eat. So if we start by just realizing
Yeah.
that we are energy processing units, and then you look back over our history and you think our ancient hunter-gatherer ancestors basically would use this season's solar energy as processed through plants and animals to keep themselves going. And over the years, we've kept upping the ante in how good we were
Yep.
at metabolizing energy. The more energy we metabolize, the more energy we control,
Hmm.
the more energy that we learn how to manipulate, the bigger our population grows, the more uh, what we experience as prosperity, comes our way. And then you just see, oh, we have been on this trajectory to monopolize all the energy we can. And now we're at the point where if we keep doing that, it's all over. So, in that
Hmm.
sense, it gives me a lot of compassion for what we've done. We're at this point where we have to understand ourselves as something other than energy manipulators.
Hmm. I mean, even in your answer there, right? Like that before we would utilize the energy from the last year,
Yeah.
right? Like that was even a transformation at the agricultural age.
Yes.
Like before that, humans and our relationship to the web of life around us didn't even have the let us dominate and control pieces of land
That's
for
right.
our own sustenance.
That's right. And gosh, it something that I'm guessing we must have known way, way, way back then, that in a way that we've forgotten so much now, is that we human beings are inseparable from the earth. We are,
Hmm.
even as Genesis 1 says, we're red earth children. We're children of the red earth. We are connected to this earth. So every breath we're uh, we're living out our porosity, that we need to take gases in and
Yeah.
let gases out, right? And every drink of water and every mouthful of food. So, uh, and something that seems to go along with this manipulation of energy is we lost our sense that we're part of it all, and
Hmm.
we developed this deep separation between ourselves and the created natural world.
Hmm. One of the ways I can imagine the energy epiphany playing out is like as you start to kind of pull it, the way it's woven both in macro things, right?
Yes.
Like our economic system or the way we're
Yeah.
connected to ecology and that kind of thing. But it's also so woven into our own lives. I think that's one of the reasons it generates this feeling of unease, this uncomfortability, because like modern life and our relationship to energy is one where it's really hard to imagine doing anything other than accelerating.
Yes.
And I mean, you, like, like our technology is always speeding up, and it's speeding up for goals that at least are required for the system to work, whether or not they're good.
Yeah.
Um, like even if you think of just transportation changing over the human story, our social life is always kind of accelerating at speed. And
Yeah.
so it's easy for people in one generation to the next generation to feel like they don't even know how to speak in a way culture hears them, and then they feel alienated, and that creates unease.
Yep.
And then underneath it, even just to pass on our existence to the next generation, it's like you may find when you pull the energy thread uncomfortability with the outcome, but you also have to keep accelerating or you're getting left behind, and you have to then teach your kids to learn how to do it or they're going to be left behind.
Yeah.
And so that doom element of it, that deep unease,
Yeah.
I think is because it's so hard to imagine a form of life where you get to opt out of something that you increasingly find
Mm.
um, problematic to to something approaching the good life.
Yes, yes. I think like when you think of the craven activities of the fossil fuel industry, uh, Exxon, for example, knew the trouble we were in, that their product was creating, 40 years ago, and they systematically covered it up and paid huge amounts of money to undermine that reality that they actually knew. Um,
Mm,
uh, but then you see that filtered out in, a major politician who we won't mention, who's running for president this year. Uh, his entire project is based on the denial of global warming. Um, he has to call it a hoax because his entire project is fueled on fossil fuels.
mhm,
So, and that's another thing that hit me in the writing of this book is the almost magical power of fossil fuels. I mean, they really are amazing, and in one sense, it's this almost like a novelist. Uh, what was it in Black Panther? Vibranium was that the
yeah,
name? Well, in a way, fossil fuels are kind of like a real life vibranium when you think that it took
mhm,
billions and billions of creatures over tens of millions and hundreds of millions of years to die and decompose and create these carbon layers of coal, oil, gas that now provide energy for us and have provided
mhm,
this huge opportunity for advancement. I mean, the fact that we're so dependent on it, we become so addicted to it, it is sad, tragic, not surprising. And now comes this massive moment in human history. Could we imagine dis- decoupling our sense of individual and corporate identity as a species from that way of using energy? My gosh, that's a big deal. And I think we can. I mean, I think it's theoretically possible. Do I think it's easy or likely? That's another question. But but that gives you a sense of the depth of the change. And for me as a Christian, suddenly all that talk about a new humanity, being born again,
mhm.
conversion. I mean, we're dealing with a both literal and figurative energy conversion that has to go on. Oh my gosh, it's yeah,
Well, when you think of the potential of a new humanity, in many ways, that requires a different kind of civilization or a different. Um, it will require reorganizing
yeah,
so many of the ways we mediate relations.
yes,
One of the things you do in the book is even look at how civilizations and collapse is something that's not new for
yes,
people of faith in the story we're inheriting. For those that might know the biblical stories but never return to them for wisdom when their own moment is
yeah,
facing collapse, like what happened for you
yeah.
returning to those texts?
So, like so many of us over the last 20 years or so, maybe 25 years, uh, I think I become more deeply sensitized to the issue of empire. That
Hmm.
empire is this backdrop for the whole biblical story. I mean, uh, you have the rise of empires as early as Genesis with the Tower of Babel,
Hmm.
and then you have the Egyptian Empire as this sort of powerful and morally very ambivalent presence at the end of the book of Genesis, and then Exodus that explodes. And then you go through the Exodus from empire is the attempt to create a sustainable way of life that doesn't require constantly expanding your boundaries
Hmm.
and becoming an empire yourself. And then for the Jewish people to live surrounded by the Babylonian, Assyrian, later, you know, uh, Medo-Persian, Greek, and Roman empires, this empire thing was a big deal. But I think what happened to me in the writing of this book is I realized empire is the sort of crowning form of civilization. And what we call civilization, the way we understand civilization is on the same trajectory as empire. And we are at this place where we have to imagine a way of life bounded by different sets of moral imperatives than we've had to imagine for a very, very long time. It's a new ball game, and the coming and going of empires is should be we should all be comfortable with that as readers of the Bible, but as people who've been shaped by the current empire, first the European and then Euro-American, and then the global economic empire that we're part of now, we have to realize our survival now depends on disentangling our identities from the values and assumptions of this empire.
Hmm. Well, what are the difficulties for Christians in America or other Christians that are uh, deeply entrenched, historically attached to our current domination system? Like,
Yeah.
what has to happen for the question you recognize as needed to be taken seriously when um, that kind of civilization and Christendom enmeshment
Yes.
can then you have a host of defense mechanisms before you
Oh
take it
my.
seriously.
Oh my.
Be it, oh, attack on Christianity, oh, attack on my freedom, oh,
Yeah.
attack on our nation. It seems to me that part of what's required is a way of handing people both the history as a nation and as a faith that de- a conscious decoupling.
Yes. Yes. Well, look, here's one problem. I have a chapter in the book called "Don't Read the Bible," and the reason is because we have been taught to read the Bible through the lenses of Western civilization. And those lenses are not just philosophical, they're deeply economic and ecological and
Hmm.
anthropocentric, meaning human beings, it's all about human beings. All of these assumptions have so affected the way that we have learned the Bible that when we refer to the Bible, we don't realize that we import a whole Trojan horse worth of civilized assumptions that are problematic going forward. And then we create this vicious cycle that when we want to be biblical, we are actually being biblical in the Western civilized dominating sense. And then it just reinforces itself, reifies itself. And that's
Hmm.
why I think there is, in recent years, a, a sense that we have to return to indigenous sources. Now, I make a case in the book that the Bible is the literature of a group of indigenous people who are more and less successful in fighting off the encroachment of
Hmm.
empire, civilization, and its values. But uh, this need to say, when did we ever look at ourselves and the universe and the earth in a way other than through the lens of empire and civilization? I mean, we're desperate. It's a matter of survival now to find that other line of sight, that other vantage point.
Hmm. And how has kind of your engagement with indigenous scholars changed the kinds of questions or framing you bring to Scripture?
Well, I mean, one thing is they help me notice stuff that was there in scripture. Uh, I mean, we could do a whole course on just reading the first few chapters of the book of Genesis as indigenous critique of civilization.
Hmm.
And the character named God in those early chapters, it seems to me, is in some ways an innocent being who doesn't understand how civilization works and just knows that we human beings better stay away from it. It'll kill us. It'll be deadly to us. And then as God seems to take shape in the book of Genesis, uh, God starts by using the methods of civilization, which is, if you don't do what I tell you, I'll kill you. So the power of violence seems to be the first tool that God reaches for. But by the time you get to the end of the book of Genesis, God sort of realizes, yeah, killing everybody doesn't really solve our problem. God has shifted God's strategy to work with Abram to bring blessing to all people, a better way of life, a better vision for life to all people, and that includes forgiving those who've wronged you, as Joseph forgives his brothers. I mean, just the book of Genesis shows this
Hmm.
trajectory. It repeats again and again and again. For example, in the book of Leviticus, all of those passages of scripture about letting land go fallow and all the rest. Oh, that's not just throwaway stuff. This is reminding us that we live absolutely interdependently with the earth.
Hmm. Yeah, it is. I mean, if you remember some of the earlier culture wars around Sabbath
Yes.
and blue laws and such,
Yes.
I can imagine there's a whole nother reason to have them again,
Yeah.
to take the battle up, right? Because if it's just a cultural marker for the superiority of one particular religious expression as the true heirs and stewards of a domination system, that's one thing. But if we recognize
Yeah.
the Sabbath as the very heart of the counter logic to Pharaoh, and the gift of the God of life for God's people and a good creation, then they, it becomes revelatory how much of our time, not even just our work days, has been seized as both information, our entertainment has been
Yeah.
collected and brought into a system that's always doing something with what we have to bring,
Yeah.
and it may be moving it against our own means.
My gosh, uh, you take the beginning of the Bible and you see that the people who are presented as the image bearers of God are not civilized people. They're naked hunter gatherers living in a garden. And so right away, you have a critique of civilization. Dignity begins with the indigenous people, right? It's not the civilized. And then you find that the workers that the values of the workers are taken seriously. Again, this civilized society exploits workers. They're people at the bottom of the pyramid to keep the people at the top of the pyramid comfortable. And then you find out in the book of Exodus, God is willing to turn it upside down the pyramid because the cries and groans of the people at the bottom of the pyramid are the workers are heard by God. And of course, it's just so ironic that that kind of language today will get you called a Marxist or a socialist and be seen as a bad thing without uh, it just shows you how little people have actually heard what the Bible has been saying to them all along. And then,
Hmm.
of course, you and I've had a conversation recently with Dom Crossan about how we can read the parables either as ways that justify that kind of exploitation of workers or as Jesus exposing of the sham
Hmm.
system that exploits workers.
Hmm.
So, and exploiting workers is exploiting energy,
Yeah.
just as exploiting the earth, never giving the soil a rest to replenish, never giving the beasts of burden a rest. And of course, Egypt was about never giving the slaves a rest. So,
Hmm.
I mean, it's been there all along, but we've been just masterfully taught to not see it.
In one of the things, a connection point both in the Exodus story and in those the parables of Jesus. Some people will go, oh well, well these things can get used to justify. But like the more insipid or ugly part of it are interpretations that have naturalized civilization. That's naturalized those habits of relations as those are the only that's normal. That's just how it is. And
Yeah,
now let's figure out how to do whatever good we can in it, like pay all the workers the same, or right. Well, when you go back to the Exodus, the assumption is uh, Moses actually needs to be told who is the God other than the one in charge commanding the building of bricks. I need a name and I
yeah,
need to know there's a story, because unless there's a God in charge of this other thing,
yeah.
then what the hell are you asking us to do? You're asking us to try to get out of a system where at least we eat sometimes? For what? And I think that that kind of, and you see this in Paul, actually, the way the function of law works throughout it. That when we treat as natural our own creations that undermine, through this kind of constantly dialing up the seizure of energy, in the ways it does, then you're asked to, like, how do we make the experience of ruining life as we go down on the Titanic better?
Yeah. Yes.
And um and the both in the Exodus story, which you could see in the way we have reread that to treat
Yes.
civilization as natural, the way we reread Jesus' parables and teachings on the kingdom of God as natural, and the way we retell, I think, and this is the hard part, what it means to be a Christian and an American, as if that's natural, where
Yes.
where the places we take stands and demonstrate our enlightened edginess and things are not the ones that call into question, uh, the all those threads of pulling energy to
Mm.
fund a system, that's threatening to our
Suicidal.
futures.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And my gosh, you fast forward from the Hebrew scriptures to the Gospels, and then you read the Sermon on the Mount with this in mind, and you know, it's so interesting. I noticed this as I was working on this book. Uh, a couple of times, Jesus kind of insults Solomon. It's very subtle, but uh, Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed as one of these. Like Solomon was really, really rich. He wasn't such so great, Uh, and so instead of looking at Solomon as your source of wisdom, who do you look to? Look to the birds of the air and the wildflowers in the field. Go back, learn from nature again, figure out your place in the, and isn't it interesting? Jesus uses the term kingdom of God, empire of God, civilization of God. The civilization of God begins with the sparrows and the wildflowers. They're part of this, and so are we. It's just
Hmm.
it's just what we need in the deep sense of resituating ourselves in the bigger, the ecological system, of which the economic system of humans is just a dirty, shabby, troublemaking neighborhood.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Like, Solomon's actually, I think, helpful, when I think of what is necessary for Christians that are citizens of our current domination system. Because when you go back and read Kings, well, his PR was very effective because what he was up to seems quite problematic.
Yeah.
Right, like, finding new prophets when his deal making with different military powers was condemned. Coming up with a way to monetize war and the selling of he develops a military industrial complex and plays both sides and sells them weapons.
Yes.
He wants to impress everyone, so he comes up with ways of having indentured servitudes for Jewish people and slaves who aren't. He comes up with new tax ways, right, to build, so, like, when you look at what the prophets end up condemning in him,
Yes.
and then the way the what would you say, the voice of the privileged in Hebrew scriptures, what does it focus on? Oh, how he handled a particular problem, between people, or how wise he was, and all this
Yes.
kinds of things. You tell those stories, and you go, "Oh, look! I mean, he basically has a golden escalator and a toilet, and he's awesome." But if you go look at what the prophets are going, like, you're not trusting God, you're trusting chariots.
Yes.
You're not being the people who embody the way of God. You're the ones monetizing the death machine and selling the very things Pharaoh and his army chased you out of Egypt. Chased you coming out of Egypt. You have invented ways around the law to then reinstitute slavery under another name and avoid the responsibility of giving freedom and then redistributing land. You do it by calling it religious exemptions
Yes.
to so to me, that like that to like showing up in Solomon's court and telling the truth is like showing up in a lot of our mainline Protestant churches and telling them congrats on getting a rainbow banner. But in the meantime, have you considered
Yeah.
your deep commitment to the military-industrial complex and the way it supports and extorts other countries, forcing them into a system where the only way to survive and to thrive is to accelerate your economic consumption, cultivate and insert your desires into a machine that we manage algorithmically? And to me, that is the thing I I see and resaw reading your book, and I don't have any clue what to do with it. It's just that when you said that Solomon thing, I think it gets at the things
Yeah.
we have as unquestioned assumptions and requirements.
Oh,
It's just part of the natural post-war order, Brian.
yeah.
Well, do you really not want us in charge of everything?
Yeah. 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 Oh my goodness. Uh, let's come to what we do with it in a minute, but just to pause with Solomon for one more minute. And he's the guy who builds the temple. And
Oh,
and
yeah.
and as soon as you see that, you think this is what empires do. Herod and the Romans build a temple. Um, it's what empires do. They love temples. And one way to read the Ten Commandments is when it says no graven images, it's a way of saying you don't want graven images because if you have those, then you'll build a temple. And if you build a temple, you're part of an economic system that keeps you from having any connection to the living God, who's the God of the wildflowers and the sparrows and the crows and the fish and all the rest of the real world that you're part of.
Hmm.
Um, Trip, this question of okay, what do we do with this? I think is uh, it is a super important question and a super dangerous question. And let me see if I can bring this paradox out. The dangerous dimension of it is that people like us whose minds have been shaped by civilization see a solution to every problem. And
Hmm.
I quote Bayo Akamalafe in the book, and I keep coming back to this quote: "What if our response to the problem is part of the problem? What if our response to the crisis is an expression of the crisis?" And this sort of fix it mentality that we always bring in. What do I do to fix this? What if that's part of the problem? What if actually what needs to happen is that the way of life that we have built actually has to stop working? And fixing it is not the way through. The way through is as it stops working, we begin to dream and imagine, to have that, to use Brugham's beautiful phrase, that prophetic imagination. What kind of world could arise from the ashes? What kind of world could emerge from the ruins, could be rebuilt from the ruins? To what kind of life could we return after exile? Those kinds of questions, it seems to me, uh, what do we do? We start trying to imagine. And that's not to minimize all the other important work that has to be done in the midst of all this trouble. I'm not
Hmm.
for abdicating at all. I am for doing the work we have to do day by day, keeping the machinery going because 8 billion people or maybe 7 billion people depend on it more or less. Um, but uh, but then imagining and dreaming of a different value system, a different way of life, different education frameworks, different religious priorities. Uh, and that to me is a beautiful, exciting kind of Renaissance type activity.
Hmm. When I think of the kind of the predicament of both recognizing a problem, knowing the levers of response are minimal in the present, while recognizing that in some sense, it's like, let us begin to cultivate
Yeah.
the habits and desires that could, um, it over time generate more sustainable relations. Like part of that then asks, like, how do you have communities, um, of formation that have a different value system at their core? And
Yeah.
those seem to be increasingly hard to form.
Mm.
Part of it, I think, is right, like that the drive of acceleration. Like we
Mm.
have, I don't remember what phrase you use, but like that need for more is required for stability,
Yeah.
right? So there's like a dynamic
Yeah.
stabilization when it goes to one's life, one's own life, but
Mm.
also uh, the systems and cultures we're in, the
Mm.
institutions we're in. That stabilization is already included growth, and
Mm.
that you can see that from our base economic model to
Yeah.
uh, even whether you feel secure as an individual. Um, and that like that vision of scope that's added, where the increased scope of sorts ends up defeating the possibility of thinking about the good life in the present.
Yeah.
And so like, oh, I need like the growth of wealth, what's accessible to you, what are you trying to attain, like the demands on the horizons of the future. All that's being there at the time we're getting more and more isolated for the very places you could cultivate conversations around the good or the beautiful or the
Yeah.
true. Um, and in one sense, there's a positive side to that in that it's a recognition of pluralism, like the multiplicity of
Yeah.
traditions and wisdom traditions that you're in, and let's not just enforce one of them in some culture way. But on the other side, uh, it seems like the modern subject who's always having to gain more to avoid loss is also never getting to the point that you start to take your own relations seriously enough
Mm.
to engage the good life, and you're not embedded in communities in places where that's what's um, being called forth, spoke into, that that is a very different uh, different kind of different a different energy
Mm.
is taking place if we try to move beyond
Mm.
the kind of demands of dynamic stabilization
Yeah.
and the ever isolation of the modern subject.
Mm. 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 Yes. And you bring up the challenge of this in being part of communities where we could imagine this and embody this together. And one of our huge struggles in this is that uh, the money to keep our religious institutions going uh, tends to come from the people who want to keep it the same. Uh, and it's one of the reasons I hope that clergy will read this book. It will not be easy on them. It won't make their life easier, but I hope it will help them imagine how important their work is for us to to create communities where these sorts where the needed conversations can happen, where practices can happen, and where in some ways we're in a position of recreating a whole new liturgy, not only the liturgy of Sunday morning, but the liturgy of life, the liturgy of a year.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, a friend of mine, one of the spiritual practices he does with his young children is on as many clear nights as they can. They go out under the moon and they notice the phase of the moon. He wants his children to grow up being aware that they live on a planet. We have this moon around, and the moon goes through phases, so that they orient themselves to the cycles of this earth. Um, and I'm not I'm not against our traditional liturgy and traditional church calendar and all the rest, but my suspicion is that the shift in values that we need to reconnect with the earth and to resituate ourselves as members of this cosmic earth community, um, it's going to require a rewriting of everything, our all of our liturgies, all of our theologies, everything. And we won't rewrite it and then practice it. I think we'll practice our way into rewriting it little by little.
One of the things about that, I think, is how civilizational stewards of the divine have constantly found a way to read the second person of the Trinity in light of the first, and the first is so often instantiated in their authority figure,
Mm.
be it a king
Yes.
or the Christian nation,
Yes.
or the empire,
Yeah.
right? And one of the kind of habits of creative suspicion in different liberation theologies or in liturgies from communities oppressed by this is learning to read the first person in light of the second,
Wow.
where what Jesus said, did, and
Yes.
endured
Yes.
teaches us the web of meaning and intuitions for describing the ever mysterious but became materially palpable in Jesus ultimate.
Yes.
And it's like when I think of, I mean, you give some rather practical examples and like places of beginning. For me, and this really came up last semester talking with divinity students when these kinds of questions came up. I said, I think this is one of the greatest gifts the different liberation theologies have invited us to do. And it's precisely that. Like, where do you begin to get the permission to say anything about ultimacy?
Mm.
Well, as a
Mm.
Christian, it's what was enfleshed.
Mm.
And I think it's when we abstract the fleshliness of Jesus and then project it
Oh,
on to the hierarchies
yes.
that are around that we
Yes.
act as normal, a
Yes.
great chain of being, divine right of kings, the invisible hand,
Yes.
the integrity of our nation,
Yes.
and all those places, Jesus becomes a subject
Oh,
of the Father, and the Father becomes a subject of the regime.
yes. Ooh.
And when you can't do that, like you could sit and tell everyone, right? And this is why I thought of it of like, oh, well, you could go ahead and start explaining everyone. That's dangerous.
Yeah.
But what happens if we actually write our prayers of confession so that we're actually confessing right out of the words of Jesus and
Yeah.
the challenge he put? Or when we think about what happens at the table and the very material body, the bread and the wine, and then the bodies of all those who have been baptized into Christ's family around the globe.
Yeah.
When that is our table, or our prayer is, let us, give us our daily bread.
Yeah.
Right? There are these places within the tradition, if we're trying to
Oh,
enact our imagination into a new space, is that you couldn't take out the crucifixion and the Eucharist and the Gospels. And so they're sitting there going like, well, when you tend to them, and that's where we get to learn what we mean when we talk about God, then that kind of inversion can happen in maybe a less abrasive way, because obviously, like, Jesus' own disciples are resisting that invitation in the
yes.
gospel. We're in great company.
Yeah. Oh my. Oh my. First of all, that Trinitarian reflection there, Trip, is, I think, is classic. Uh, the person I remember saying something like this was Elton Trueblood, who
Mhm.
used to say that the doctrine of the incarnation is not that we had a definition of God, Jesus came along and we applied it to him, but that we had a definition of God, Jesus came along and required us to redefine God and reconceive of God. And and as you were saying that about the first and second persons in that Trinitarian language, it also made me think, what would happen if we allowed ourselves to take the third person,
Mhm.
the Spirit, and our experience of the Spirit in life seriously as well, and in
Mhm.
that way, let the three persons be in dynamic interaction, which then throws our settled hierarchies within within God into a dance rather than
Mhm.
a chain of command. So much going on there. And when you mention, you think of the baptism and the Eucharist, and you think that for John and for Jesus, baptism doesn't take place in the temple; it takes place in a river. Suddenly, that that makes me think: couldn't part of their whole that whole movement have been let's get back in touch with the God who we encounter out in the wild, right? Not the one inside of man-made structures. And then the Eucharist, to use eating imagery, is a way of saying, remember, everything you eat is part of creation.
Mhm.
So you're connected, you're interdependent with creation.
Yeah.
And to remember me is to remember your interdependence with creation and with one another. Ooh, that's a big that. I mean, it's all there, but we have very nicely, I mean nicely in the most sarcastic way possible, we have nicely camouflaged it all in empire and civilization affirming understandings.
Well, and now this is going to sound very Baptist, but I mean, I actually think that's one of the problems theologically. Not that you can't do infant baptism well, but one of the important things theologically, in insisting that adults become Christians,
Mm,
is, and you can see in the early church, like look at the Didache, the early church kind of discipleship training manual.
yes.
When it goes to baptism, it's like you need to find living cold water, where you wash, drink, and hydrate.
Yeah.
Go there. Now, if you can't find that, then, maybe we can find, and it goes through like a
Yes.
number of options,
Yeah.
but like none of them said, in the water where you are baptized in to the identity of God belovedness and orienting yourself towards neighbor and enemy love happens in a place where you are simultaneously being woven in to the power of the imperial state, right? Like, it's a kind of enactment that makes you do what? Go to a place in your own ecosystem where
Yes.
everyone goes all the time. This is
Yes.
where you go to wash, where you go to drink, where you
Yes.
go get your water. Like, this is where you go. And when you come out of that place that sustains all the life around you,
Yes.
like, that's when you know, like, whose you are.
Yeah.
Like, yes, you are the beloved of God and you were raised to new life. And what does that person's life you're raising with look like? Like it happens here. And they can, and I think the kind of theological shift of taking the entrance into the body of Christ,
Mm,
the disciples' response to the call, from the place that's at the heart of a community before sanitation and running water,
mm,
and then putting it inside
mm,
the cathedral. It's at the center of your city or
mm.
town, that is the story that weaves together that
Mm.
empire, state, and nation's sacralization of their
Yes.
deepest interest.
Yes.
Like that shift in and of itself
Ooh.
is uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And some of the ministers listening get in trouble just by not having an American flag in their sanctuary. But
Yes.
but in many senses, like the idea that the church owned land that had a permanent bath for bringing people in is already a big shift.
Yeah.
And I think part of the shift is that the identity one is choosing in baptism, you're choosing to participate and understand yourself as the community seeking to share the mind of Christ. And that is really dangerous and it's really hard to imagine. I think it requires a community, but it's hard for the community to do that if the entrance space is one that's also where they're getting citizenship for most of
Ooh, ooh,
Christendom,
yes. Yes.
or where it is connected to the cherished identity and projections your parents have on you,
Yes.
so that you go get your baptism at
Yeah.
2 months or 7 years,
Yeah.
and or you get confirmed at 12 and now you're glorious. Like,
Yeah.
I do think that notion of religious identity, that as we've so woven fidelity as a Christian to becoming a good
Yeah.
citizen
Yeah.
and a good capitalist, and or a good worker, or whatever way we want to
Yeah.
do it,
Yeah.
then the requirement that you go to the source of life that will be there for the next civilization to find your identity
Ooh.
with the coming of a new creation
Yeah.
gets undermined.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Powerful stuff. And of course, when you say that, and then you think, okay, if I'm a church member or a pastor or a denominational official of some sort, uh, uh, you know, I don't think we can expect that this is going to get fixed from the top down. I don't think any Martin Luther is going to come along and create a new order that makes all of this work. I think this is going to require uh, all of us looking for ways and sharing ways and experimenting with ways to and finding language to help us reclaim those deeper understandings. And there might be new ways entirely. I've only experienced this probably less than 10 times, but I've been with a group of people where we're going to take a hike. Let's say we're going to have a 5-mile hike up a mountain or out and back along a trail. And we maybe started by reading a passage of scripture or reading a poem. And then we said, okay, for the first mile, we're just going to walk 2 by 2 and talk about it, and then we'd huddle up along the trail and share what we were talking about with one another. And then we might say, okay, for the next mile, we're just going to be quiet. We're going to walk 1 by 1 and just have a chance for us each to reflect. And then we'd get to the 2.5 miles out, and maybe we'd celebrate the Eucharist and share that together under the trees or on the mountainside. And then we would, we would just arrange the hike as a series of, maybe we'd walk three people together for a period of time and talk together. Oh my goodness, those experiences I will always remember. This feeling that we are creating a liturgy with our feet and in the outdoors that is that's shaping us in some of those non-imperial ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the one thing I thought of, um, of places even in the tradition, right? Part of it is the Protestantism increasingly cut itself off from wisdom that happened earlier, in the same way,
Yeah.
right, that if you even read the New Testament without the Hebrew scriptures, you end up becoming a Gnostic, a good old Marcionite, and all sorts of things. So the but the Epiphany celebration for the
Yeah.
Orthodox Church is one of my favorites. When I was in Los Angeles by the beach, we did it where you go down to the water, which is very easy to do if you're by the beach, and you throw a cross out into the water. And then you do this a prayer for Epiphany. But the historic prayer has to do with the recognition of Jesus as the beloved of God, and the waters of baptism. And then once the prayer's over, all the kids break into a sprint into the water to go find the cross. And it was there. Obviously, I didn't keep all of it in the prayer. It was there, but like that, this is something the church has done. And like, where does the Epiphany take place? Or like part of the Epiphany, right, is the wise men recognizing Jesus as Lord and Herod, right, not. But also like connecting with baptism, like where's the cross found? That's one of the places you go find it on Epiphany Day, and it's not at the font at the beginning of the church. It's in the water that everyone goes to all the time. And that's the place you dive in and get it. Like there are these little places in the tradition, I think, where retrieval for the needs of for what discipleship needs in the present, we can find that there are things like in the storehouse of our tradition that can be brought out. Like the earliest Easter liturgy announces the resurrection to the rest of nature before you ever say he's risen indeed. And I didn't know that, but Elizabeth Johnson in her book, who is in Ask the Beast, her eco theology, like points it out. And it's like, oh, why did we cut it out? Well, because we thought the resurrection over time was increasingly just about us, right? And then the Protestants were like, and it's just about you, and I hope you know where you're going. Like, but the early church, there is a whole different wisdom when in testifying the resurrection, that if you name your non-human neighbors first.
Wow, that's part of the message. Oh, near the beginning of the book, I talk about that I have this fantasy of grabbing every religious leader by the lapels, no violence intended, but just saying, why don't you wake up that this is an emergency? And in whatever scope of influence we have, I think we're getting to the time where people are going to say, this is an emergency, and you have permission to act like it's an emergency. Uh, and and when we give ourselves that permission, who knows what creativity will inspire us and what new uh, ideas will unfold.
Well, what if you just got a hold of whoever decides what Lily gives money to? Because when so many of the grants that are connected to best practices in scare quotes for the future of ministry are based on the need to sustain a system that was so attuned to what's been revealed to be an engine of death. I feel like what would happen if you had a giant grant and it was just like, look, if you are seeking after the truth, we got you paired up with some mentors so that you aren't just going to go get prophetic to be an idiot and then feel like a victim. So now you won, but like you got like high quality pastoral counselor and you got a team. And if you get fired for this, your family still has health insurance. And this is our new best practice, is not using the debt slavery of theological education and the imagination captivity benefits to keep you from at least preaching the gospel before you get out the door. Because and I'm sure you've had this experience where the moment this conversation ends, you'll get an email if someone listens to it, it's like, Trip, that was so blah, blah, blah. I love Brian. This is great. I read the book. And then all the terror of all the points of power that the system that keeps people from, or that keeps people muting certain areas, being ambiguous and stuff comes in.
Yeah. And here's where we have to be willing to live with all kinds of dynamic tensions and even paradoxes and contradictions, because the fact that we talk about health insurance is the product of insurance is based on a whole economic system and assumptions about the practice of medicine that maybe we'll just not think this way. Our descendants, several generations ahead of us, will just not think this way. This, to me, is one of our huge challenges. As I was writing this book, I've really, since 2016, almost 10 years now, I have been working on a science fiction book. And one of the things about science fiction that attracts me is it involves the imagination of different worlds. And it's very hard for us to imagine living without money, but it's not hard to imagine a different world where people live without money. And that's the kind of imagination I think we're going to need going forward.
Well, have you read Ministry for the Future?
Yes.
What do you think about that? So like when you're thinking of like, I mean, it's obviously not science fiction, but it is like it's future casting. I guess say a bit about that book in of itself, because I think one of the things this book's inviting, especially faith leaders, to think about is, what does it mean to prepare a church and communities for situations that are on the potential horizon that we may not want to acknowledge yet?
Yeah. Well, for those who are familiar with it, Kim Stanley Robinson's book, Ministry for the Future, puts us forward, I forget, 30, 40, 50 years. The climate crisis has continued about on the current pace of inaction or ineffective action. And things are now at a desperate point where the United Nations realizes that all of our current structures exist to help currently living people. And currently living people voting for their own self-interest will systematically disenfranchise and impoverish the earth for not only for all future generations. So they're trying to find a way to let the voices of future generations get a say in our debates of the present. I mean, that alone is worth the price of the book to let that sink in. And then what happens is as you go through the book, you start imagining what would it look like if we got desperate enough that we got serious to try to address these issues. And you have eco-terrorism, and you have banking innovations, and you have all kinds of attempts to try to make things better. In Life After Doom, I present I tried to digest all of the information I could out there and simplify it into 4 possible scenarios for our future. They're very, very broad. But Kim Stanley Robinson's book really exemplifies the first scenario that I call collapse avoidance. We don't know if they're going to succeed, but we know that they're working to try to avoid civilizational collapse. We have a lot of other books that describe my 4th scenario, collapse extinction, where human beings either have gone extinct or on their way to going extinct. Because one of our great fears is, as our relationship with the earth, as the health of the earth deteriorates, our civilization that's so dependent on exploiting the riches of the earth, our civilization begins to stumble. And when it stumbles, will the worst in human behavior come out? So it's easy for us to imagine our civilization getting its act together and everything can be fixed, or us destroying ourselves and it's all over. The thing that I think we need is additional scenarios of other possible futures, just so that we don't go into either a hopeless or a overly optimistic binary there. Yeah.
And so what did you put between the two?
Yeah. So if you start with collapse avoidance, we could avoid collapse. The second scenario would be collapse rebirth, where there is a civilizational collapse that would result in a lot of suffering and a lot of harm. But there would be enough strength that something could be reborn. The question is, would it be reborn to just repeat the problem, or would we gain the wisdom in the process of collapse to try to have something better be reborn? So collapse avoidance, collapse rebirth, collapse survival. This is a scenario that a lot of people who really study this sort of thing suspect, which would be the process of civilizational decline would take us far enough down that we couldn't rebuild civilization as we know it anytime soon. And so some number of human beings would survive, but it would be in a very different reality. And then collapse extinction. So those are the 4 scenarios.
And how does thinking about that, playing on the title, which is why I thought of it, about what would your ministry for the future class look like, right? Like if we're thinking about what it would be like to do ministry now, thinking about the future, both like the kind of skills, reflection stuff that should happen in education, but also when we think of say those of us that help write job descriptions for our clergy, or think through the way we spend our time and money as a congregation and things. If we're thinking about ministry for the future, what kind of things would begin to show like some ethical consideration beyond the normalizing of our current civilization?
Oh, man. Okay. Well, the first thing I'd say about that is it would do us good to have conversations like we're having now that spread throughout all of our religious communities among both paid and lay leaders, where we say, let's imagine collapse avoidance is possible. Collapse avoidance, I don't think, is the best option. It's not necessarily the best option. We could avoid collapse in the 21st century in a way that made extinction more likely in the 22nd or 23rd century.
Mm-hmm.
So are we really going to learn our lesson this time around? But what would we advocate for if we wanted a healthy kind of collapse avoidance?
Yeah.
What values would be required? How would we teach these values to children? How would religious leaders promote these values? I mean, that would be a phenomenal way to structure an entire leadership formation, right?
Mm-hmm.
What? But then we should also say, if collapse avoidance is impossible, and there's so many factors that could make it impossible, what would we need for a good and healthy collapse rebirth? You know, this, for example, something I think about a lot is if we believe that some form of democracy is a good way to organize people, it seems to me we all ought to have a democracy first aid kit that we're putting together, which says if your political systems fail you, then how do you bring together 10 or 15 or 20 people and create an equitable decision-making structure for a healthy kind of community life? And then how do you link those groups of 10 or 15 into groups of 100 and 500 and so on? You know, a kind of first
Mm-hmm.
aid democracy kit. That would be the kind of collapse rebirth, the collapse survival. What would we want people to know and learn? What are the virtues that would help us survive in a dignified and humane way? So, and someday we may come to a situation where we're in a collapse extinction scenario,
Mm-hmm.
and we have to imagine what would spiritual leadership look like in that kind of a scenario. There's a very gifted young writer named Isabel Drury who's writing about these matters. And she said, I don't think we'll know if we're uh, the midwives of humanity or the hospice care for humanity. I don't think we'll know until it's the very end. So we have to now pretend or behave like we're doing midwifery of a new humanity uh, until the very end. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
but maybe one other thing I'd say, if I could imagine what an emergency response would look like, I I think we have a few denominations that could get enough unity to move forward together. I don't think it's very many. You know, the UCC might step out, the Unitarians might step out, but I think Pope Francis is doing his very best to argue for this. But we see the American bishops and many other bishops, their real interests are with the people who give them money, and the people who give them money don't want Pope Francis. So I I think what we have to imagine is ground up grassroots kind of movements that get congregations saying, yeah, I'm a United Methodist, but I'm also part of this movement where that's an ecumenical movement for the well-being of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that kind of an ecumenical movement, we need a lot of different Christians, but we'd want all the Jews as part of that movement that would be willing to, and all the Sikhs and Hindus and Buddhists and so on, and Muslims. You may have heard a group of Muslim scholars just came together a few weeks ago and came out with a Muslim version of Laudato Si. So we start to see the beginnings of this kind of movement across religious organizations. What we don't see enough of yet, though, is the real organizing to start behaving like it's an emergency. We're trying to add things on to the status quo, the normal way of doing things, which is good. But eventually we're going to realize we're in an emergency and it's going to require further steps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's particularly for American Christians, there's a significant hang up in the sense that our denominations are run by people that love denominations and their particular denomination, but their
Yeah.
churches that have people in them are increasingly less attached to any particular denomination.
Yeah.
And so, part of getting kind of an ecumenical energy of sorts is figuring out what is the shape of cooperation and cooperative action when institutions that are just trying to survive off the legacy, peak American Christendom, uh, as it's ending, like each seminary and div school is trying to figure out how to
Yes.
be part of the ones that survive.
Yes.
Each congregation in their area, I want to be the one
Yeah.
that makes it through. Each denomination is trying to figure out how to do that while they split about sexuality issues, right? You can imagine as a leader in those spaces not knowing when you have the margin to think bigger and
Yeah.
going like, what are we pouring ourselves into?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me say one thing about it, Trip. First, I think it's you. One thing you're doing is you're bringing it up because we have to bring the question up. Look, there is a way in which our current denominational structure is really bad for the mission that we say that we're about of loving our neighbor and loving the earth and being makers of peace uh, and what it does is it makes people more aligned to, you know, 500,000 or 1,000,000 people spread around the country, and so much so that they have almost no connection with their own city or region or watershed.
Mhm.
And uh, one of the things that I think we're going to need going forward is the people in a town or city or maybe a small state or a region of a state. We're going to have to say, look, right now, it's nobody's job to care about the well being of this community. The politicians are only worried about the well being of their party. The politicians are only worried about the well being of their financial donors. In so many places, we've lost any sense that politicians are worried about the common good. And very often the clergy are not worried about the common good of all the people in their community. They're worried about the people just in their common congregation or just their denomination. What would happen in a town if all of the spiritual, not all of them wouldn't do it, but some of the spiritual leaders were to get together and say, well, nobody's showing up for this job. We're going to have to start acting like we are the kind of elders of this community. And we're going to have to step up and start caring. Well, what that's going to mean is there's going to be 12 Methodists and 6 Presbyterian and 7 Episcopalian and 6 American Baptists and whatever it is. And these and the 3 rabbis and 2 imams and so on. And they're going to have to get together and say, how can we work for the common good in this region? There are organizations who have tried to do that kind of work, but it ends up competing with all of the infrastructure that sucks out so
Yep.
much energy. So that's one place where I think there would be a change. And then the other place would be these permission-giving movement structures that would let people say, you have permission to admit we're in an emergency. In an emergency, the rules change. So now we have some freedom to open up our imagination and behave differently. Interestingly, people might be surprised for me to say this, but when you think of something like the Willow Creek Association that Bill Hybels started, or the Purpose-Driven Association that Rick Warren started, they're interesting examples of this because they worked across denominations, but they gave people permission to innovate in other ways. And I think that's what we need, but on a much bigger framework. Yeah.
Well, I mean, even that language, the episode of Emerge that came out this morning, Tim Keel says the same thing about what it was like when he met Chris C. And then is that first time he got together and they told him what a postmodern was and all, and he was like, and it was this, he says for a long time, American religion, denominations was the answer for how you educated, created curriculum, accountability structures, and organized and all these kinds of things. And there was a whole group of people where preserving what you're inheriting didn't work.
Yes.
And this group of friendships became a place, and much like what happened in the Willow Creek Association, he says, but one where it wasn't like here's our best practices and how we succeed at X, kind of, it had a different ethos.
Yes.
In listening to that back through, if you're editing this thing, you listen a bunch of times. And
Yes.
and Tony had talked to Daniel Schroyer about Journey, And one of the things that they both discussed that is why, I mean, it was, if you ask me, my favorite thing about the emerging church movement is that the locus of spiritual formation is in community. It's not the individual. That the goal is not getting an individual to assent or assert something, protect something, or understand something, or do something. That the primary place of spiritual formation is with others. And Tim said, I had to do this because I needed a community where I could be a Christian. And I can think of lots and lots of people, probably more now than 10 years ago, who have that deep desire, or people that could end up resonating with it. And the more the scarcity and shrinking of previous periods churches go, the less and less options. And I just think, I mean, my own experience moving back here, if you're finally not working at a church or like at a school where you're friends with all these people that also work at churches, and like it's not that hard, you get you have this experience of trying to go to all the places in your community and be like, do they share any of my values? And well, then they learn to enact them in any way that invites me into it. And the number of places I went where me, who's like got to be one of the more kinder new guests, like having been a minister for 15 years, I'm gentle. Like there are places I went 4 or 5 times before someone I didn't know talked to me. The number of worship services that so unwelcoming to people that either aren't completely fluent in the tradition or aren't a mature adult on ADHD meds or bored, right? Like you aren't allowed to be a kid. Like we don't do that to our kids in school anymore. Like we learn that people have multiple ways of understanding and engaging and learning. You have multiple senses, multiple learning styles. We don't think a 5-year-old should pretend to be 30. And yet the number of churches where they even get to be kids is small. They're supposed to pretend to be retiree. And so like, to me, that like part of the crisis is like the need for a community with deep shared values around potential futures, whether it's, from collapse avoidance to extinction, but like we're at least going to try to midwife our lives together. And then the institutions that are available are ones where you're asking you want sermons that are somehow better than the really bad psalms being sang with bad atonement theories, but the aesthetic is 1950s, and the children it has to be the least exciting hour of the entire week for them. And that is where we're inviting them into a love that turns enemies into family. Like, to me, like that's the overwhelming part. I told Tim, I was like, this just makes me want to go plant a church. This is what Tripp gets pissed. Because he even says, like, I don't think the problem is that the gospel of a people shaped by Christ isn't compelling and life-giving. It's that there aren't too many communities that would like to be disturbed by it. And it's interesting how more theoretically progressive communities invent just so stories for continuing to normalize patterns and aesthetics and such that sabotage it. Sorry, that was my venting that probably should have gone to my therapist, Brian, but
Well, I'm glad to be of service. Glad to be of service. But as you were venting, so many people I know were shaking their hands or groaning or face palming or something because they're experiencing something very similar. And this, to me, is one of the it gives us permission. It's a permission-giving moment. If we're in an emergency, the rules change, and we have permission to experiment. And we don't have an excuse that we can just complain that other people haven't fixed it. In an emergency, that other people aren't going to fix it. Each of us can step up in the ways that we feel gifted and empowered to do so. And that to me is it's what I experienced as well in the emerging church experience. It was this sense, oh, good, there are other people who know this isn't working, and they're experimenting in some creative ways. And by the way, this also helps us to go back and see our own tradition in a new light that's very permission giving too. So, for example, we could say the movement of Jesus starts as the Roman Empire has reached its peak power, is reaching its peak power, and will soon begin on a long period of a slide downward.
Mm-hmm.
And right when the church makes its deal, when the bishops of the church make their deal with Emperor Constantine to become a part of the empire with its protection and so on, that's when a whole group of insightful spiritual people say, we don't really want to be part of this. We're going to form new communities out in the wilderness, which we say the desert or wilderness, but they went out into nature. We're going to go out into nature and create communities where we try to figure out how we're going to live. Or over on the other side of the Roman Empire, the Celts are having their own experiments and trying to not be Romanized and maintain a way of life that's not part of that destructive civilization. So we've got this in our DNA, and it's not just true for Christians. It's there are Hindu versions of this and Muslim versions of this and Jewish and Buddhist versions as well.
Yeah. The book's coming out in May. I think this will get released around release date. By then, everyone will know that you're coming to beer camp this year. But one of the things I would say for those thinking about coming to Theology Beer Camp that are in leadership at their communities is that Brian and a number of there's like a network of progressive churches that have started and are kind of like, encouraging each other, getting together and such. They're helping to facilitate a pre-event with intentionally for people trying to lead faith communities. So it'll basically be during the day before it starts, like that night, like after dinner. And then there'll be other things throughout beer camp this year that are different than others, like liturgy sessions for working on like how you write liturgy and stuff and thinking about prayer and formation. Like it's a lot more holistic. But specifically just for those of you that are in a community thinking about this, if you're coming, you should check out the pre-event because like enough ministers were there last year asking these questions and said, can we please have a time to get together, not to like derail the event, but just because all these people that showed up that don't have a faith community, we want to be the community if they're our neighbors that they come and join us. Because we're losing people if we get clear on this. And we're trying to negotiate and like, how do we pray into this space? How do we enact in here? If that conversation's exciting to you, there'll be people from all over the country having it together. And, if you're thinking about it and just need to go so that the Holy Ghost can call you to plant one, then you can always do that too. So
there you go.
This has been a lot of fun, Brian. What did I like completely avoid? Because I got through half my notes and then Tripp's own engagement came primary.
No, I loved it. I loved talking with you about anything, Tripp, and I love the questions you asked. I think it's been great.
Well, it is exciting. Everyone, you want to go check it out, and I'm looking forward to hanging out in person, Brian. It is always exciting to get to do so.
That'll be good. That'll be good, my friend. Thank you. Always a pleasure to be with you.